Indrani ma'am, I would invite you and you start the event. Yeah, sure. Yes. Good evening, everyone. Today, iSPELL is celebrating 108 Sunday Sahityik Satsang. And on this occasion, we have Dr. Varun Uthappa, the keynote speaker. We have Dr. Veena, Master of Ceremonies, and we have Dr. Captain Indrani ma'am, is an EC member. I would request Dr. Indrani ma'am to introduce the guest and welcome all the participants and brief about the objectives of iSPELL India. Please, ma'am. Ma'am, you are muted. Indrani ma'am.
Indrani, unmute, please.
Yes.
Yeah.
A very good evening to everyone present over here. It indeed gives immense pleasure to be a part of this 108th Sunday Sahityik Satsang. On behalf of the event coordinator, Dr. Uthappa ma'am, I'm just taking a role to play over here for a short while to flag off this particular event. We feel very happy and proud as a EC member that our forum, which has served the society during the COVID pandemic situation since 2019, it has been officially registered now as Indigenous Society for the Promotion of English Language and Literature, shortly iSPELL. How is small to make the people understand that it is I with everybody, and to go all along with everyone. We see that elevating and facilitating is a part and a motto of this particular forum, which actually which actually has given many new topics to the people who are literary lovers. And I feel very proud also to be a part of this. Why? Because from 2019 onwards till date, not even once Sunday has been missed with this literary feast. We all wait for this particular moment to know and to listen to great peoples and their experiences and the wide knowledge what they have. Today's topic is on English phonology in action, a diversity perspective. A young writer, a young leader who is here, a young keynote speaker is here, Dr. Varun Uthappa AG. We feel very happy to have you here. On this occasion, I just take immense pleasure to welcome you. But before that, I have my immense duty to introduce one of my good and best friend, that is Dr. K.S. Veena ma'am.
AG.
Yeah, AG Veena ma'am. So I always feel that she is a person with great attitude who is there serving Kaveri College, Kodagu. Dr. K.G. Veena ma'am is an assistant professor of English heading the Department of English, Kaveri College, Virajpet in Kodagu. She was awarded the doctoral degree from the University of Mysuru in 2021. Her thesis titled The Lotus and the Maple, a comparative study of the select novels of Margaret Atwood and Dr. Kaveri Nambisan. I feel very happy to share that we both did a PhD under the same guide, Dr. Vijay Sheshadri, who is presently the chairperson of English Department, University of Mysuru. Dr. Veena did her early education in Bengaluru and a master's in Bangalore University. She has contributed a lot in this academic, and she is one who has worked on the completion of PhD from the Dravidian University, Arappan, under the supervision of Dr. A.S. Puvamma. Finally, she was awarded the PhD during University of Mysuru. We also see that she has presented many papers in the district, state level, national and international level, many seminars. She has presented a paper, and then one acknowledging one is that she has presented a paper in Innsbruck University, Austria. She has published poems and articles. As an individual, we could see that she is a very enterprising lady. Many students do follow her and find her that a very inspiring lady. I have attended most of her seminars and conferences, what she has arranged, which are very, very organized and meticulously planned. She has translated many poems and from Kodagu language to English. And presently, she is the coordinator of IQAC. She has lectured on women's rights, Articles 370, human rights, research methodology, and so on. She has judged various debate and elocution competitions. Veena ma'am, it gives us immense pleasure to have you here on this platform to continue to be the captain of this particular event, 108 Sunday Sahitya Satsang. Now, it is yours, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Indrani. Thank you so much for such a warm introduction. And I really deem it my pleasure to be listening to you, actually, Indrani. It is really a pleasure to listen to you. And a warm welcome to each one of you for this 108th Sahitik Satsang of iSPELL. And as we know that Dr. A.S. Puama ma'am had to be here, but due to some unavoidable circumstances, she is not here with us. And she has given this, this role to Dr. Captain Indrani to do whatever she has to in taking the ship forward. And I really thank Dr. Indrani for accepting this on this nick moment. I know she would have told you this morning and you have accepted it. I thank you so much for that. And without much ado, I take up this opportunity, and I feel proud to be the master of the ceremonies of today's 108 Sahitik Satsang of iSPELL. And I am here to introduce Dr. Varun Uthappa AG, a person from my own land. And seeing him, I really find it so enthralling, such a young man over there. And he has done so much for the betterment of so many people around. And here I read out his profile. Dr. Uthappa is a speech language pathologist and assistant professor at the Eastern New Mexico University, Portales, United States of America. Is a member of the Indian and American Speech Language and Hearing Associations, is an alumnus of the All India Institute of Speech and Hearing, Mysuru, India. He holds a post-professional doctorate in speech language pathology from Loma Linda University in California, United States of America. As a speech language pathologist, he has worked in a variety of clinical settings in India, Singapore, and United States of America. He has published research papers in the areas of language processing, reading, and bilingualism, and has authored a book chapter on a natural language sampling-based assessment procedure in Kannada. Oh, such a wonderful profile, sir. And I really find it wonderful to be listening to you in the following minutes. And I really welcome you, sir, for this 108th satsang. And I want you to enlighten us on the topic, English phonology in action, a diversity perspective. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. KG Veena ma'am. That was so lovely of you and kind of you to introduce me in such a wonderful manner. First of all, I'd like to thank all the organizers of iSPELL India and the 108th Sahitik Satsang for having me here today. Thank you to Dr. KG Veena, Dr. Momita Dey, Professor G.A. Ghansham, Dr. Pramod Dhengle, and Dr. Captain Indrani, and all the attendees who are here to listen to us talk about English phonology in action, a diversity perspective. I will go ahead and share my screen.
Yes, sir, visible.
Thank you so much. As Dr. KG Veena was sharing, I am a speech language pathologist. So as a speech language pathologist, what we do is we serve individuals who have communication or swallowing disorders. Now, from a speech language pathologist perspective, when I think of English as a language, or any language for that matter, I think of it as a medium for communication. And understanding the diverse perspectives within the language, across languages, and how different people use languages is central to providing culturally sensitive services to the individuals we serve. Now, as educators, teachers, and professors, I'd like to think that the situation is not very different. So with this background, I would like to share a few thoughts about English phonology in action. To begin with, I'd like to talk about a brief history of the development or the evolution of the English language. As most of you would be aware, that English might have begun possibly in the early medieval England, one of the Indo-European languages. And then over a period of time, English has changed from Old English to modern English. And one particular event stands out here in the context of phonology, and that is the Great Vowel Shift. And here is an example to indicate that. The word bite as we know it today previously was called beat. So these are some of the changes that have happened over time with the language itself, creating its own diversity. Fast forward into the current world, and English is the largest language of the world if we were to consider both the native and non-native speakers of the language. And the spread of American culture seems to have influenced how we use English in today's world. Now, if we were to consider only the native speakers of a particular language, I think Mandarin Chinese would be the largest language in the world. But with English, there is a distinct difference in that English is spread geographically throughout the world, whereas with Mandarin Chinese, you would see a greater concentration of speakers in a particular region of the world. So basically, the introduction to English from an evolutionary perspective, from a diachronic perspective, tells us that as a result of these evolutions, as a result of where English has reached around the world and the different cultures that English has influenced and the cultures that have influenced English, has created the diversity for the language itself. And I've listed a few ways in which we could view English as being diverse, because English has many different versions, even for native English speakers. For example, there is the Australian English, the general American English, or the received pronunciation. You also have English speakers who are not native speakers of the language, and they could be second language speakers or additional language speakers. And individually, each one of us are different. Each one of us probably here right now would have unique experiences. We'd also have shared experiences, but we'd also have unique experiences in terms of to what extent we have been exposed to the language English and what is our mother tongue, what are the other languages that we know. There are so many different ways in which our experiences differ. So there are individual differences. And another segment that I would like to touch upon is the distinction between neurotypical individuals, the so-called abstract notion of normal, as well as neurodiverse individuals who may have anatomical or physiological variations either by birth or something that is acquired during one's lifetime that could create differences in the way one perceives and uses language. So there is diversity redundant within the language itself that is very important to consider. Now, we would like to talk a little bit about English phonology. Now, this particular information in the beginning of the slide might be a little redundant, but I'd still like to share because the central topic of today is English phonology in action. So phonology, as you would all know, is a branch of linguistics or language, which examines the study of speech, which studies speech sounds and their patterns within a language. And I'd like to share that it's also applied to manual languages. Earlier, the smallest meaningful unit of a language, the phoneme, was represented differently with manual languages as a sharem. Now, both manual and oral languages are studied together under the rubric of phonology. Now, when we talk about phonology, there are two things that we need to look at. One, of course, the speech sounds of a particular language, the phonemes, the smallest unit of a language that influences meaning. To give you an example, I have the word cat here and the word mat here. Now, all we need to do is change one phoneme here, the K, the initial K and the initial M, and we will see that the meaning of the word changes. So that is why K and M or K and M become phonemes of the language. The other aspect in terms of the study of phonology is the arrangement of these phonemes to form different words. And if we take a look at this example here with the word cat, if I were to transpose the K and the T, or move the position of the T right after K, then that would not be a true word in English. The combination of the K and the T in the initial position of the word is not allowed in English. This might be allowed in the final position. Think of the word act or fact. So there are certain rules to which English phonology relies on, and that is how every language proceeds. Now, why are we talking about English phonology and what phonology means? Before we understand the diversity within phonology, we kind of need to know, have a background of phonology. Let's take the example of General American English. Now, this is again a diversity-sensitive term. Previously, it was called Mainstream American English. And now we recognize that we do not necessarily hierarchically represent languages as a baselect, a meselect, or an acrolect. So we are going to be using an inclusive terminology, and one such terminology is General American English. General American English has 24 consonants and 20 vowels, and the vowels can be categorized into monophthongs and diphthongs. Now, here is a list of the consonantal phonemes, as well as the vowel phonemes in American English and the words that correspond with those sounds. Now, the question that we must ask is, are these phonemes the same across the English varieties? And the answer would be not quite. Interestingly, the consonantal phonemes are not very different across the different English varieties, particularly in the English-speaking world. There are a few exceptions, however. For example, if I were to use a Scottish accent, when I say the word when, I might say it as when. And if I were to use the African-American English, instead of saying that as a fricative, I would say that. So these are some of the differences in the consonants across the native varieties of English. Primarily, though, the differences between one native variety of English to another is with reference to the vowels, and they are the ones that are responsible for the accent changes. Now, here I'd like to compare General American English with British English. If we take a look at these vowels here that have been marked with a star, you will see that there is an R or a rhoticization of the vowels in the American version, but you will see that those rhotic aspects vanish in the British version. For example, the word bird, as we say it in the General American English, would become bird in British English. Likewise, with the word ear becomes ear. So these are some of the differences that exist in terms of phonology between two native varieties of English. Now, these are phonemic variations. Now, the question that comes about is, are they phonotactic variations across the English varieties? And the answer again is yes. And these variations are there even in the native varieties. And here we're going to be comparing the African American English to General American English. The words that, for example, in General American English, if we were to produce the word story with an R, in African American English, it would be said as stowee. And likewise, I have a few other examples here. I'd like to draw your attention to the clusters. Instead of saying the word fast in African American English, one might say fast and not say the T in the end. Or the word ask or ask can become ax. So these are some of the ways in which both phonology, both phonemes, as well as phonotactics can be diverse across native English varieties. The next question that comes to mind is, what about non-native English varieties? Now here I'm going to be taking the example of Indian English. In fact, you will see that I've put in an inflectional morphological marker, plural marker ES in here to signify that the Indian English phonology is not one single phonology, and it does vary based on one's first language, education, and exposure to the language, and of course, quite a few other factors as well. Now here I'm comparing the Indian English with the native English varieties. Here are a few examples of how they differ. The fricatives th and the, as in think and this, are produced as think and this primarily. The aspirated plosives, for example, in the word, if I were to say the word park in American English or British English, I would probably say it with a bit of an aspiration going park, with the H sounding out right after the P. However, these two phonemes are not distinct in the native English varieties because there is no aspirated and unaspirated version of the same phoneme. Whereas in most of the Indian languages, we do have the aspirated version as well as the unaspirated version, and the meanings of the words changed. So they are phonemes, distinct phonemes, which is not the case in the native forms of English. So if one were an Indian English speaker, then it is likely that the individual might not aspirate the phoneme P or might over-aspirate the phoneme P when saying the word park. It would be park or park. Another example is the T and the D. In the native varieties, the T and the D would be produced slightly from the front part of the mouth, with the position being sort of an alveolar or dental position. I will talk about it a little more in detail in the latter part of the presentation. If it were the Indian version of Indian English, then it would probably sound as time and tide and not time and tide. Another difference would be in terms of the cluster reduction. The word acts could be said as acts. You will see that the T is missing. Or there could also be a vowel insertion, a schwa vowel insertion. For example, the word film could be said as film. And there are some other variations that I would also want to talk about, and that is the reduced vowel inventory. For example, in the native varieties, we would use two distinct vowels to say the words cut and about, whereas in Indian English, these two vowels may sound similar. There is also the process of vowel elongation. Instead of saying the words nail and soul as a diphthong, meaning two vowels coming together, speakers of Indian English might tend to say nail or soul, as making the vowel A and O longer. The same can occur in words like pua and tua. Instead of the diphthong, the vowel can be elongated, and then there would be the R sound, as in pur or tur. There could be devoicing of the final fricative. For example, in words bridges and glasses, the S in the final position in native varieties is typically voiced. It becomes a Z or a Z sound, whereas in Indian English, it would be the S, wherein it is said as bridges or glasses. And there's also a lack of distinction between the W and the V, and most Indian languages do not necessarily have the approximate glide W. So the word vanishing could be said as vanishing with a W or somewhere in between. So these are some of the variations between a native English language and English as a second language, or a third language for that matter. Now, having spoken about English language first, the diversity redundant within the English language, and then about the diversity in terms of the English phonology, now let's talk about English phonology in action. In other words, how do we use English phonology? And here we'll be moving towards individual differences. There will be factors which would be applicable to a large group of people, but we would also be trying to be sensitive to variations that can occur at an individual level, which can create differences in how we use English phonology. When we talk about using phonology, it could be in terms of perception, the processing aspect of phonology, as well as the productive aspect of phonology. In the perception, you will notice that I've put in pictures, images of the ear, eye, as well as the hands. It's because phonology can be processed through any of our senses. And it's although the hearing sense is the primary sense to process phonology, in an acoustic form, there are other senses that also contribute to how we understand English phonology. Think of Helen Keller, who learned the English phonology primarily with the tactile modality, and of course with a little bit of input from the proprioceptive and kinesthetic sense, we would assume. You will note that there is a picture of an iPad or a tablet, for that matter, with a speech generating device in it, and a software that will generate speech. Now, these are tools that are used by individuals who are nonverbal or partially nonverbal, who might have to use a speech generating device in order to communicate. So there is always the option of choosing a variety of accents. So that's where English phonology comes into action in this context as well, because the different accents can be really associated with one's identity. So if a person were to use a speech generating device, the person would want to use an accent that represents that person's identity. And that is where English phonology could be put to action. There are other ways in which English phonology could be put to action. For instance, the knowledge of how we manipulate the phonemes within a language is directly correlated with how well one learns to read. So these are some of the ways in which English phonology is actualized. Now, the overarching purpose of the diverse aspects of English phonology being put into action is primarily communication. It could be daily communication. It could be communication for just a conversation. It could be scholarly communication. So the options are endless, but the overarching purpose, the central theme, is primarily communication. Now, let's delve a little more in detail about the different aspects of the actualization of phonology, starting with perception. Now, in this particular picture, you will see, in this particular slide, you will see pictures of a newborn and an infant about 6 months of age and an infant about, say, 9 or 10 months of age. Now, if an infant, if a newborn were to listen to two different kinds of sounds, one gibberish and another where an individual is possibly talking in many different languages, the newborn is automatically tuned to listen to the languages versus the gibberish. Now, fast forward into about 6 months of age, if the child were to listen to two languages which have similar phonological structures, similar rhythmic variations, and were to listen to languages that have very different suprasegmentals in terms of rhythm and stress and intonation, this infant is more likely to listen to those languages that this child has been exposed to, and those class of languages which follow similar suprasegmentals. Now, going into, let's say, the 9 months of age, then there is even more fine-tuning happening. This infant starts to listen only to the language that the child is exposed to, and there is finer distinction that is happening. So initially, babies are open to receiving phonological input from any language, and they are tuned to languages over random sounds. But as the infant experiences a given language, the suprasegmentals of that language makes an impression. So if we were to compare, let's say, English, Kannada, and Spanish. Now, Kannada and Spanish are primarily syllabic languages. So if a child were to listen to, if a child exposed to Spanish were to listen to Kannada versus, let's say, were to listen to Hindi, then the child would tune to Kannada more initially than the child would tune to Hindi because of the suprasegmental similarities between Kannada and Spanish, in contrast with, say, Kannada, in contrast with Spanish and Hindi. Eventually, an infant tunes to the phonological structure of the language that the child is exposed to. So what it tells us is earlier the exposure to the language, the better the possibility of learning its phonology, because the younger the child can grasp the phonology of many different languages of the world. And there is not as much language specificity in terms of the tuning of the perceptual system. Another evidence regarding the tuning of the perceptual system comes from the evidence with the second language acquisition. Researchers have found that earlier the age of acquisition, the speakers of second language English will have a better native-like accent. So there is a lot of diversity in here, depending on the age of acquisition. So a child may be exposed to the second language, in this case, English, maybe when the child is an infant. It could be when the child is a school, or it could be when the student enters university or college. So here, as educators and teachers and professors, we will see that there could be this expansive diversity in terms of how one would speak, depending on the age of acquisition of that particular language. Now, there are always exceptions, individual differences. One, you might say that there would be individuals who are exposed to English at, let's say, at the age of 10 and still continue to have a native-like accent. And those differences do occur because the aptitude for pronunciation is also a factor that we need to take into account. Now, having spoken about perception, now let's talk about production. Now, for production of speech, we will need the nervous system, the central nervous system, as well as the peripheral nervous system. So this is where the message to produce a particular sound is initiated. And then this message is carried over by the nerves to the speech production system. And this influence between the nervous system and the speech production system is bidirectional. So there is feedback going in from these structures back into the nervous system as well, which helps us regulate how we are speaking and modify how we are speaking, depending on the input that the system provides the brain. Now, here in this picture, you will see the lungs, the trachea, the windpipe, and here you will see the vocal folds or the larynx. This is a schematic representation. And here is the region called the pharynx, and then you will have the oral and the nasal cavities. Now, if we divide this into different systems, you will see that this is the respiratory system. And here you will talk about a phonatory system, then the resonatory system, and then the articulatory system. So these are the systems that are responsible for speech production. Now, speech is generally produced on exhalation. But it is important to note that phonemes in all languages of the world are not always produced in exhalation. There are sounds that are produced on inhalation as well. So there are languages with ingressive speech sounds. But for the purpose of English primarily, we can say that speech is produced on exhalation. The air that is responsible for the production of speech is initiated at the level of the lungs. This air moves through the trachea or the windpipe and then goes into the larynx or the voice box. It is at the level of the voice box or the vocal cords that the noise, the sound energy that is coming from the lungs is converted into voice. And after the sound is converted into voice, then the sound travels through the pharynx and the oral and nasal tracts where resonance comes into effect. Now, to give you an example, if the sound energy were to pass through the nasal cavity, then you will hear sounds like or For all of the other sounds, you will see that the air travels through the oral cavity. So the resonance alters the different sounds that we produce. In terms of voicing, a very easy distinction would be between the S and the Z or the Z sounds. For example, if I were to say S, and place my fingers on my throat, you will see that there is no vibration happening when I say S. If I would say Z, then you will feel the vibration happening. So that is a distinction between the voicing and a lack thereof, or a distinct variety of voicing for the S and the Z. Now, after the sound travels through the pharynx and the oral and nasal cavity, you will also see the role of articulators. Now, articulators are structures that provide a constriction for the airstream that is going out of our mouth or our nose. So there can be active articulators. Active articulators are those that move, and there could be passive articulators that do not move. The examples are here. The active articulators that we have are the tongue, the lower jaw, and the lips. So we make many different movements with these structures in order for us to produce the sounds. And the passive articulators, for example, are the palate and the teeth. So these are the ones that alter the sound energy to produce different speech sounds. Now you might ask me, what does this have to do with phonemes, accent, and diversity? Let's take a look. Now, when talking about the different phonemes of the language, here we are representing a native variety of English, and I've taken these images from a wonderful website, The Sound of English. The references are given towards the end of the presentation. If you are interested, you could go and check it out, and they will have all of these images corresponding with each of these sounds. You can click on the sounds, and then you will see the images of how the articulators move for different sounds. You will see the P, B, and the M, the P, B, and the M, occurs with the closure of the lips, the upper lip and the lower lip. And you will also see the position of the tongue here for each of the different sounds of the English language. Now, you might ask me what this question mark really is. It's a glottal stop. For example, in the British English version, if I were to say water, if I'm disinterested in saying the T, I might say water. So that becomes a glottal stop. If I were to say better without the T, as in better, then that would be a glottal stop. So these are different consonantal phonemes of English, and how there are variations in terms of the movements that occur within the tongue, the mouth, the lips, as well as the lower jaw, that create the distinction between phonemes. Now, you will see that there are certain rules that are necessary to be fulfilled. For example, for me to say the P, B, and the M, I have to close my upper and lower lips. But the extent to which I might close my lips would be different for each individual. And that's where diversity comes into picture with reference to phonemes. Now, this is the representation of the consonantal phonemes. If we categorize them in terms of the place of articulation, so where is the constriction happening? Is it at the level of the lips, the lip and the teeth, the labiodental, the dental at the level of the teeth, the alveolar ridge, the region right behind the teeth, the initial part of the roof of the mouth, the post-alveolar region, that is the region behind the alveolar ridge, the velar region, the region of the palate, primarily the soft palate, and then the glottal region, that is referring to the level of the larynx. You will also see that the sounds, the phonemes can be distinguished in terms of manner, in terms of the way in which the airstream exits. Does it exit after a complete stoppage? For example, in the sounds per and the bur, there is a complete obstruction of the airstream, and then we release the airstream for it to be for the sound to actually actualize. In terms of a fricative, you'll hear a noise. For example, if you were to say, there is a bit of a noise there that is created. An affricate is basically a combination of a stop and a fricative. And likewise, you have variations in terms of how the airstream is taken out of the mouth. And that's why you will have mouth or the nose. And based on those variations, you have terms like tap, flap, nasal approximant, lateral approximant, and glides. So these are some of the ways in which we classify the consonantal phonemes of English. Now here we'll take a look at the vowels of English. And you might ask me, what is the third eye? And this is not the eye, actually. This is the movement of the lips. Now, for example, if I were to say the word the tongue is going to be in a relatively higher position, and it's also going to be towards the front of the mouth, and the lips are also going to spread. I would say be. So these pictures talk about the movement of the tongue as well as the lips as they correspond to the different vowels of the language. Now here, this representation is based on received pronunciation. Depending on the accent that one may use, these movements will also change. This is another way of representing the different vowels of a language. Here, if we were to consider this as the x-axis, so to speak, it talks about the position of the vowel in terms of tongue advancement, the front of the tongue, the center part of the tongue, or the back of the tongue. And this vertical dimension talks about the height of the tongue body. When we say tongue body, we are referring to this particular segment of the tongue. We can divide the tongue into functional categories as the tip of the tongue, the front of the tongue, the center, the back, and the root. So we're talking about the central part of the tongue primarily. So depending on how the tongue moves and where the tongue moves, we can distinguish the different vowels of the language. And the expanse of this vowel, or in other words, what it would be called vowel space, is different, again, for different speakers of different accents, and individually as well, the vowel space can be very different. Now, having looked at the different phonemes of the language, we can now take a look at the diversity in terms of development. So if we were to look at native English-speaking children, recent studies have told us that 90% of the children by the age of 3 should be able to produce these phonemes, the P, B, D, M, N, H, and W, the phonemes that represent these letters, and likewise for these phonemes. Now, this is, there would be individual differences here as well. It simply means that not every child is going to be able to produce all of these phonemes at this particular age. There will always be differences depending on a variety of factors. But in general, you will see that this is a pattern that is followed by children within the United States, and the global sample represents children who are native English speaking in the other parts of the world. Now you might ask me the question, what about bilingual children with another first language, and how does this tie into diversity? Studies have shown that there could be an acceleration effect or sort of a negative effect or a deceleration effect of bilingualism. If there is an overlap in terms of the phonology between the first language and English language, then the overlapping phonemes tend to be acquired faster, even compared to monolingual English-speaking children. Those phonemes which are not overlapping and they're exclusively in English and not in the first language tend to take a little longer than what typical monolingual children would take in order to acquire that particular phoneme. Again, there are individual differences. So this is how, these are some of the ways in which the actualization of English phonology can be different across individuals, even if we consider typical development. Here are a few more examples in terms of the diversity of the phonemes of a language. Now, previously we looked at the place of articulation, the manner of articulation, and how each of these sounds are produced. Now, here we're going to be looking at subtle differences in the coordination of the structures that are responsible for speech production. And these differences are also unique to each one of us. There will be shared characteristics, but at the same time, there are unique characteristics. Now, let's take the example of the phoneme P as well as the phoneme B, the P and the B. Now, in both cases, the message is going to be initiated from the brain, and then the peripheral nervous system is going to be responsible for sending the message to the speech system. Now, the moment I start thinking about saying the sound P, even before the voice occurs, you will notice that you would have closed your lips together. Oh, am I going to say P? Okay, I better start closing my lips first. Now, this is the first action that happens. And then the vocal folds will start vibrating. And eventually, as the air proceeds and enters the oral cavity, then we will release our lips and then the sound P would occur. Now, if we go to the sound B, then the procedure is pretty much the same. The pattern is pretty much the same, but the only difference is that the voicing is going to happen slightly earlier compared to when I was saying the sound P. So this is basically telling us that our structures are so very well fine-tuned that when we produce a particular phoneme in a particular language, there can be so many factors that can contribute to the differences that might be perceived in terms of how the phoneme is actualized. For example, there might be a slight delay when I'm closing my lips. There might be a delay, or it might become faster when I release my lips. So there are differences such as these that can contribute to the diversity of the actualization of the phoneme. Now let's take a look at some of the differences between the movements of the speech mechanism for a phoneme produced by speakers of different languages with different language experiences or accents. Now here I'm comparing a form of Indian English and a form of received pronunciation. Now, in both cases, if I were to say the word prize with the sound P or the phoneme P, I would be approximating my upper and lower lips, and then I would be releasing it eventually. But if I were an Indian English speaker, then the likelihood of the amount of pressure that I exert between the upper and lower lip would be more compared to the amount of pressure that I would exert between the upper and lower lips. I might say prize with a little more force between the upper and lower lips if I were to be using an Indian English accent. If I were to use a British accent, I might go a little gentle and I might go prize. So that these are subtle differences depending on the accent as to how speech physiology sort of manifests. Now, here's another example. We talked about the T being produced slightly towards the back of the mouth with Indian English varieties and towards the front of the mouth with the British or the American English varieties. Now, if I were to take the British variety, if I say the word talk, for the T, I'm going to be closing the mouth with the tongue towards the front part of the mouth, just behind my upper teeth, towards the alveolar ridge. So I would say talk. Sorry about that. Now, if I were to say the same sound with an Indian English variety, then I would move the tongues further behind, and then it would not necessarily be a talk, it would be a talk. So there is difference in terms of how I say the same phoneme and how the same phoneme is actualized depending on the accent that I use. Now, this does not mean that all speakers of Indian English or all speakers of received pronunciation are going to be producing the sounds in this particular manner, but these are general variations that are observed and could be anticipated depending on the linguistic exposure of each individual. Another example is in terms of oral resonance. If I were to speak with a British accent or an American accent or a mixed native accent, then most of my speech sounds would be generated from the front part of my mouth, and there would be a collection of resonance over here. But if I were to speak in an Indian English, then the likelihood of the resonance occurring would be towards the center of the mouth or towards the back of the mouth. It's because of the differences in terms of how Indian languages have their oral resonance present. So these are examples to show that speech physiology and the production of speech sounds or English phonology can differ depending on language exposure and accents. And again, there will be individual differences. Another aspect that adds to the diversity of English phonology in action are the anatomical and physiological variations of the speech mechanism. Here are schematic representations of the newborn and adult vocal tracts. You will see that there is a distinct difference. You will see that the palatal region is kind of upright in the adult, whereas it is kind of leaning down and descending in the newborn. You will see that the distance between the vocal cords and the oral and the nasal cavities is very, very less. Here, there is a lot of difference. There is a scope for a lot of resonance happening here at the pharyngeal level. So these variations, the neurotypical developmental changes in the structures of the speech mechanism and the nervous system also are responsible for the variations in English phonology during development. If we were to think of an infant who would start by probably saying baba and mama, and there would be this same infant would go through diverse experiences with phonology and eventually would be able to possibly say flossinasalahilabilification, if I said that right, probably one of the longest non-technical words in the English language. Now, another version of diversity is when anatomical and physiological variations occur, as a result of which there could be differences, what we categorize as disorders in terms of the production of speech sounds. Now, I've used the term neurodiversity because some of these or most of these differences can be viewed as not just disorders, but also as differences compared to how we view the general world. And there are so many individuals amongst ourselves, and we ourselves do go through phases of neurodiversity as well at times, if we were to have an acquired condition that could lead us to speak in a different manner. Now, there are so many different causes of speech sound disorders which can lead to variations within English phonology, and I've put in images of a few things, a few conditions that could represent the same. Take, for instance, the condition of hearing impairment or hearing loss, for that matter, when a child or an adult would have difficulty perceiving the sounds through the auditory modality. The realization of the phoneme during production can also change. So in that way, there could be diversity in terms of how one produces the English phoneme. If a person were to have a cleft lip or a cleft palate, then the realization of the phonemes also change because the physiological dynamics for the speech production also changes. Here is an example of a person who may have a tongue tie, as a result of which some of the apical tongue sounds may be produced differently. Say, for instance, the sound t might be produced as th because the tongue and the jaw have to move together instead of the tongue moving distinctly from the jaw. Now, there are so many variety of causes for speech sound disorders. There could be the functional cause, where we actually do not know what the cause is, but there could be articulatory or phonological differences occurring. The cause could be motor or neurological. It could be structural, as in the case of cleft palate or cleft lip, or it could be post-surgical. It could be a sensory perceptual disorder as well. And here on towards the left-hand side, I did give a few examples about children who might have developmental or other speech sound disorders. Here, I would also like to talk about adults who might have variations due to conditions that might alter their anatomy or physiology. Take, for instance, the case of Parkinson's disease, where an individual might be speaking in a festinating manner, start by speaking in a very clear voice and end in a very muffled manner. So the English phonology varies even within a single communication event. Take, for instance, the example of cerebrovascular accidents or strokes, where individuals might be speaking slightly differently because the mechanisms are altered. It might be more effortful, it might be less effortful, it might be different. So the phonology might sound different in each of these cases. And there's also the case of invisible disabilities, conditions such as autism or attention deficit and hyperactivity disorders. These are conditions where phonology and accent and suprasegmentals of the language can also vary. So these are very many ways in which the actualization of English phonology can differ. Now you might ask me, how are neurodiversity and diversity overlapping? Aren't these disorders and aren't the other conditions typical conditions? Well, it's yes and no. Let's take the example of the foreign accent syndrome. Now, this is an identified disorder where an individual suffering from a cerebrovascular accident or a stroke after the stroke starts speaking in a completely different accent. Now, here I've taken the example of an individual who typically spoke using the British English pronunciation or the general British English, and then after the stroke suddenly began speaking using a Welsh accent. So there is, so now there is the distinction between what is a disorder and what is a difference is kind of blurry. So because of this nature, it is very difficult to separate the two elements completely. And for the purpose of communication, if we want an inclusive society and we want to include each and every one of us into that society, the idea of viewing everything from a diversity perspective is beneficial to all. To summarize, I would like to state that sensitivity to diversity does enhance the value of English phonology and any language in general, because that enhances the opportunities to for inclusive communication for one and all. And I did hear Dr. Captain Indrani share that the objective of iSPELL is with everybody and goes along with everyone. And I think that ties very well with the idea of viewing English phonology and the actualization of English phonology from a diversity perspective. And to highlight again that the purpose is primarily communication. So I'd like to end with this particular slide. We did start by talking about how English evolved from early medieval England to modern English and to the English that we know today. But in the last couple of decades, the emphasis on diversity has been salient, and the emphasis is bi-directional. It's not just about how English has reached different people and different people are using English for different purposes. It's also about appreciating each of their cultures in order to enrich the language itself. So the benefits of diversity is definitely bi-directional. I would like to leave you with this thought by Thomas Berry. He calls himself, late Thomas Berry, he called himself a geologian. He was a philosopher and a religious leader. He said, the greater the diversity, the greater the perfection. Here are the references to this presentation. Thank you very much for patient listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Uthappa, for such a wonderful exposition of English phonology. I was indeed delighted listening and to learn about what English phonology was all about. And I think all of them in the participants who are listening to you would have really enjoyed the session. And it's time for interaction, and I am just looking out for questions over here. And I request the participants who want to ask any questions to unmute themselves, and you can pose questions to Dr. Uthappa. He would really try to clear your doubts if you have any on the session that he has just given. And I see everyone writing over here. It was a wonderful session, excellent, lucid deliberation. And we have Murali Krishnan sir asking for you to share the slides. He says, good slides, could you please share them? And that would be really fruitful, sir. And
I shall upload it to the chat in a while.
Sir,
okay.
can I ask just one question?
Yeah, ma'am,
hello?
you can.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, ma'am, you can. Yes.
Sir, first of all, congratulations. It was very interesting. Particularly for me, I teach phonetics and phonology in my Master of Arts course. So I just wanted to ask that the phonetic alphabet that you have shown, the symbols, you were using capital N for Anga. Is it correct?
Oh,
We use a different symbol.
I think that would be a display error due to a technological limitation. Some of the characters in IPA, when they are presented on different softwares, they kind of change character. Yes.
Okay,
So it is
okay.
not a capital N. It is more like a small N with a curve in the end. Yes.
Exactly, sir. Thank you, sir. Because capital R and capital N are for different sounds in IPA.
That is correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then secondly, you were saying that in language acquisition, the age factor matters. Do you think gender can also be a factor in acquiring a language? Are the girls slow learners or something of that sort?
It is actually the other way around. Usually, early developmental research does show that girls tend to acquire certain aspects of language faster.
Yeah.
So we do not exactly know why that is the case and whether that is the case in all situations. So it is very difficult to make a blanket statement saying that yes, girls or boys, or depending on gender, one would learn a language faster or slower. But yes, there are studies that do talk about these variations.
And sir, when we teach, we say that language is non-instinctive. But in my family itself, as you said, it can be learned very easily when one is of young age. So my grandson, who was just 3 years old, he could read and write so well. So how to create that kind of atmosphere for English in the family? No extra efforts were made, but he did it on his own, just by coining the words in newspapers and all. Even the parents didn't know.
Well, that is why we always stress upon individual differences, because we never know how genetics and epigenetics, as well as the environment, are going to interact for a child to learn a particular entity. So, well, congratulations that the kid is able to acquire those skills even with limited exposure. But more often than not, we may not realize that we do not necessarily have to explicitly teach everything to a child. And incidental learning is one of the major reasons or major factors that influence development. So there could be things that the child is exposed to, which we may not necessarily consciously have implemented, that could have aided or scaffolded the development of this particular child, the skill that the child is displaying.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, ma'am. Thank you.
Sir, is there something called perfect English or perfect way of expression of certain words, that it should be in this way or that way?
Well, thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the question, because I did want to touch upon this towards the end and I missed it. In the initial part of the presentation, I spoke about how we previously used to view language in a hierarchical manner, so to speak. Like at the lower end, you would probably have the abnormal phonology, and then you will go into dialects, and then the basilex, the mesolect, and the acrolect. So this hierarchical view of language is, in my opinion, erroneous. Because if we are to promote an inclusive society which is embracing diversity and which promotes the facilitation of English language to many different people and embrace their differences in terms of how they use the English language, then we as a society have to appreciate these differences and acknowledge it. So in that way, I would say that there is no precise way, one precise way to produce a particular sound or have an accent. However, we do need to ensure that there are certain, within certain constraints, certain phonemes are produced in a certain way. So, for example, if I were to produce the sound P as a K, then it wouldn't make sense. So the differences should not be as gross, but if there are finer differences, then I think that would be fairly typical, and we have to address it as under the diversity rubric.
Thank you, sir. But I have seen wonderful speakers unable to pronounce certain words. You know, they pronounce it in a very weird manner. So is that a kind of a disorder, or is it common with everyone that they have, like, for example, I find it difficult to pronounce guests, G-U-E-S-T-S. It usually comes out as guest. So is that a kind of a disorder?
Absolutely not. It is a variation influenced by your individual language exposure and pronunciation abilities and whatnot. So everything from genetics to the environment, any factor that influences. It is certainly not a disorder. And I think that was one of the variations that I did share in one of the slides where we're talking about clusters being reduced. Instead of saying the acts as acts with the T missing. So these are, and the example that you shared was also one of clusters where you had the T and the S in the end, and the S preceding the T. So there were like S, T, and S, so three consonants put together. So that these phonotactic structures are not necessarily present in all languages. So depending on our first language, native language, or the other languages that we are exposed to and their phonotactic structure, the way in which we speak can differ. So I would certainly not consider that a disorder.
Thank you, sir. I don't
I
find
think that is
any
al- I think that is also because our organs get so used to pronouncing the sounds of our mother tongue that when we learn a
Yes.
second language after our mother tongue, then we always have difficulty, just as Indians always have difficulty, as sir has said, in pronouncing the fricatives, particularly th, the, and j. Those sounds are not there in our language. Thank you.
Yes, yes, exactly, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Can I put in a question, ma'am?
Yeah, sir. Please go on. Yes.
That was a wonderful presentation, because I need to tell you that because he has touched upon all the basic issues related to what we understand as phonology. Now, thank you, sir, for the presentation. Now, my question is, generally English teachers, when there is a change of, especially change of curriculum or syllabus, now we have new authors and new terminologies coming up. And in the classroom discussion, maybe if it's a new textbook, especially I'm talking about general English classes, and new authors, maybe African or European or Latin American or maybe Eastern European like writers. And we don't know how to pronounce those names of those authors, And once we pronounce them, later on we come to know that that is not the way it should be pronounced. And this is a common thing among English teachers. Then we cut a sorry figure before the students. So is there any, especially in these days, it's easy to get the details. Those days, maybe 20 years back, it was difficult. But can you suggest any method of telling the students that, this is the way it has to be, or how can I find, or how can we find the pronunciation of those emerging authors having a different kind of spelling?
Yes, I think this is a very practical question, and I have made this mistake myself so many times, and I do make it very often when we refer to different research articles and try to name the authors, and like, am I saying the name right? But I think one way I do check for pronunciation is by referring to the etymology of the word. So if I know where the word has come from, then I can check what language I need to go ahead and look in the internet and say, how do we pronounce this particular word in this particular language? So depending on, because most of the words that are difficult to pronounce, so to speak, are not necessarily English words. They could be loan words or borrowed words. So understanding where the word has come from kind of gives us a good starting point to know, to look for how to pronounce that particular word based on the language that it has been borrowed from. I hope it answers kind of the question a little bit.
Yeah, that's there, and for names of authors, I think that can be this confusion. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there anyone else who would want to question? Okay, so let's move on to the next section. I would love to introduce the chairperson. I think Madam Dr. Maumita Day is present. Oh yeah, I can see her.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, participants, for this interaction. And I would love to introduce Dr. Maumita Day, the president or the chairperson of today's session. Dr. Maumita Day is an assistant professor and the head of the Department of English in Holy Cross College, Agartala, Tripura. She has received a PhD degree from the Center of Linguistics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She has completed her MA in the field of linguistics from Jawaharlal Nehru University and a BA Honours in English from Scottish Church College, University of Calcutta. She has published a number of papers in national and international journals and has presented a number of papers and in national and international conferences too. Her areas of interest are the typological studies of languages in Northeast India, as well as in the field of English language learning and teaching. At present, she also holds the office of the academic coordinator of Holy Cross College, Agartala, Tripura. With such a fantastic profile, I would love to invite Dr. Maumita Day to present her remarks on today's session. Over to you, madam.
Thank you so much, ma'am. First and foremost, a very good evening to all. Well, the keynote speaker, Dr. Varun Uthappa, Dr. Captain Indrani, Madam Veena, Professor Ghanshyam, Ma'am Puvamma, who is not here, all the members of iSPELL, India, iSPELL, Karnataka Forum, and of all the members of iSPELL regional forums of the other regions. A very good evening to one and all. Well, first and foremost, I would like to congratulate all the members of iSPELL India, along with all the members of the regional forums, that now iSPELL is registered as an indigenous society. It is indeed a great achievement for all of us. So congratulations is something that needs to be put on a public forum. So I take this opportunity to congratulate each one of us. I also would like to congratulate Dr. Uthappa for the wonderful session today. Well, I must say this was something which was very important as teachers of, English, literature and language, when we address our students. And many of the universities, many of the colleges in India today are given the responsibility of teaching these students not only literature but also linguistics, the basic linguistics, I would say, and the language issues, especially phonetics, English phonetics. So as teachers, it's very important for us to be aware of some of the basic facts. And thanks to Dr. Uthappa for the wonderful session. Well, I must say English is actually a tricky language. In most of the words that we have in English, they do not follow their spellings into pronunciation. And many of the speech sounds in English seem to have, similar spellings. So there's always this differences when we teach students how to write a particular word and how to pronounce that particular word. And to add to that challenge, we also have in English, say, the presence of your irregular plurals, then irregular past tense. I must say the presence of the zero morphemes that we have. All these, increase and heighten the complexity of the language when we as teachers try to teach English to non-native speakers of English. That is what we have English in India being taught as. So, the learners of English often, they cannot correlate the spelling of a word when they try to pronounce it. So the native speakers, I'm sure, they also face a similar problem. Like they are the ones who have acquired English since their birth. But I'm sure when they go over to the formal school education setup, they get the formal system where they have to actually learn to read and write. I'm sure they also have a similar challenge that they face, even if they are not native speakers. And many adults, well, as Sir said, we also have challenges, when speaking, pronouncing the name of certain authors. We also do make mistakes. So having the proper knowledge of English phonology and phonetics today is of paramount importance. That is, if we want to actually speak and handle English in a proficient manner. Dr. Uthappa also have addressed the issues of, learning versus acquisition, second language acquisition, first language acquisition. Also, I would say how learning, the learning issues and all these things. Well, addressing these issues of learning English, I must say that when English is learned as a second language in a formal education setup, its processing is likely to be significantly different, right, from English acquired as a first language. Now, irrespective of receiving education in the same language, the proficiency levels always do not match that of the first language processing. If we take into account the way, learning takes place, or the way acquisition takes place, we basically have two different methods. When we acquire a language, it is basically the auditory phonological processing that takes place, which enables and helps the either the native speakers or even the non-native speakers to process language in a very natural way. So acquisition helps, and that enhances the proficiency levels, versus definitely the visual orthographic mechanisms that we put forth when we ask students to learn English as a language. So when we compare these two processes, what we see is that the visual orthographic mechanism is not that helpful compared to the auditory phonological processing mechanism. So, which we can say validates the claim that yes, acquisition itself, whether it's a non-native speaker's case or a non-native speaker's case, whether it's a first language acquisition or the second language acquisition, phonological system, the auditory system, this particular mechanism actually enhances and is more effective than learning. Whether you talk about, first language or the second language. So I would say it was a very, very wonderful session, very informative, helpful. And thanks to iSPELL India as well as iSPELL Karnataka Forum for organizing such a wonderful session and, enabling all the speakers, all the participants to hear Dr. Uthappa and the way we can enrich ourselves as teachers. And also, I would say not just as teachers, but also as learners. So thank you so much for inviting us today on this forum. And I am glad to be part of the forum. I express my thanks to all the organizers, also to Ghanshyam sir and Dr. Uthappa in particular for the wonderful session, I must admit. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, ma'am, for summing up on English phonology. It was indeed nice hearing you today. And now I request and invite Professor G.A. Ghanshyam, founder and General Secretary of iSPELL, to have the concluding remarks and present the certificates. Sir, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Veena. Indeed, this 2nd October, which is not only Gandhi Jayanti, but also Lal Bahadur Shastri's Jayanti. So on this particular day, we have not only witnessed, but also listened to various modalities and also action-oriented kind of a presentation by Dr. Varun Uthappa. And it was on phonological diversity, and even in a country like a multicultural country of ours, wherein the pronunciation matters a lot. And as far as South India and North India is concerned, there is a long gap between the pronunciation aspect of it. And even I was remembering one particular fact that some people in the North, they do call like Chiknaikan Halli. And in Kannada, it is Chiknaikan Halli. If you say Halli and Halli, there is a difference between that, because Halli becomes the lizard and Halli becomes a village. So there is a long difference between that, and that's why maybe the words may not be there, the things may not be there, or the pronunciation, it matters a lot. And nowadays, as far as multicultural aspect and multicultural countries are concerned, now we don't have English, we have Englishes, and that's why the pronunciation, as far as we people are concerned, and when we study English in India, we always believe that received pronunciation matters a lot, RP matters a lot. But nowadays, pronunciation doesn't matter at all. The only thing is, how are you communicating to the people, and if the person is able to understand your language or not. And if he can understand your language well, I think that's the basic essence of communication, rather than going deep into the pronunciation aspect of it. But at the same time, being the teachers of English, being the learners of English, being the students of English, one need to understand the various nuances related to the language. And for that, I really thank Dr. Uthappa for doing the honors on the platform of iSPELL. And this is a kind of a scientific topic which he has delivered today, which not only makes us to understand the technicalities in it, but at the same time, we too feel that there are many people around us in the society, those who are suffering from various different abilities, rather, I must say. They are suffering with different abilities, and they too are having a lot of problem as far as communication and pronunciation is concerned. And Mysore is the place wherein the Speech and Hearing Institute is there, which not only helps the people and even guides the people, and they do have practical aspects of it, wherein Dr. Uthappa is also an alumnus of that particular institution. And I do feel happy that I visited that institution, being Mysore, my hometown. So it gives immense pleasure for me to understand various aspects related to it. So thank you very much, Dr. Arun, for doing the honors on the platform of iSPELL right away from USA. And you are not only connecting all of us with English, but at the same time, you are making us to understand various things which are in and around the society. So I would like to request Pramod Dhengle to present the certificates on behalf of iSPELL, Indigenous Society for the Promotion of English Language and Literature, and the basic motto is facilitate to elevate. So what we do is we always facilitate people to elevate themselves and also the students as well. So this certificate on the concluding remark goes to Dr. Varun Uthappa, AG, for doing the honors on the platform of iSPELL. Dr. Varun, please accept this certificate as a token of gratitude.
Thank you very much. That is very nice of you.
And for doing the honors on the platform of iSPELL as the chairperson of today's event, 108th Sunday Sahityik Satsang, Dr. Maumita Day, this certificate is a token of gratitude from iSPELL.
Thank
Please
you, sir.
accept.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
This certificate was to Dr. KG Veena for doing the honors on the platform of iSPELL, being the Master of Ceremonies of 108th Sunday Sahityik Satsang. So Dr. Veena, kindly accept it on behalf of iSPELL.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity given. Thank you.
Thank you. And this is our next 109th Sunday Sahityik Satsang, wherein we are going to have Dr. Priyanka. So she'll be speaking on second language acquisition, and where Dr. Uthappa has left and various queries were there related to that. We are going to have another session on theories and implications of it. So do join us in the 109th Sunday Sahityik Satsang on the next Sunday. Over to Dr. Veena.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the honors. I now request the event coordinator, Dr. Captain Imrani, to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Veena ma'am. It was really literary fest today, though we are celebrating in Mysore. We are celebrating Dasra festival. On these occasions, we have come to this 108th Sahitya Satsang. It indeed gives me an immense pleasure to propose vote of thanks on behalf of Dr. Puvama ma'am, the event coordinator of this month, October month. iSPELL is an official registered society, and now it is named as Indigenous Society for the Promotion of English Language and Literature. As I've told you earlier, this is a platform which has created many such opportunities for the academicians, and we feel happy to spread this particular news across the world, to know about it. What is that deliberation given over here? I remember a few of my students coming back and telling, ma'am, can we take up some of the topics for the research which has been deliberated from iSPELL? I happily agreed it. I said that, yes, you can go ahead and attend the programs regularly so that you'll get to know what is that actual felicitating or facilitating and elevating happening on this particular society. So I feel very happy, and many colleges have come forward and signed MOUs along with iSPELL. And we feel very happy also about it, that it is flourishing worldwide. On this occasion, on behalf of iSPELL, as well as on behalf of event coordinator, I express my deep sense of gratitude to the keynote speaker, Dr. Varun Uthappa, AC, who is an assistant professor of communicative disorders, Eastern New Mexican University, USA. Sir, it was indeed a very, very clear, lucid deliberation. It has really made us to enhance and enrich our knowledge. Thank you so much for your time and for your deliberation. Thank you, sir. I express my profound gratitude to Dr. Maumita Day, Assistant Professor of English, Holy Cross College, Agartala, Tripura, ma'am, for summing up all the deliberations in a nutshell. Ma'am, thank you so much for your contribution. My special gratitude to the Masters of Ceremony, one of my good friend, Dr. Veena KG, Assistant Professor of Kaveri College, Virajpet. Ma'am, you literally did justice today leading up this particular event. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, madam. Thank you so much.
My highly acknowledged gratitude to the founder, Honorable Founder Secretary, Dr. Ghanshyam sir, who is always there, and the idea which has sprung up in his mind, it is really making us to see the new horizon and literary field. Sir, thank you so much for this wonderful platform. And now it is officialized. We can go ahead with multiple such elevations, deliberations, even across the world. Thank you so much, sir. I take immense pleasure even to thank the president of iSPELL, Professor Anupama Ora ma'am, Dr. Prashanta Chakravarti sir, Dr. Ashok Satdeva sir, Murli Krishnan sir, Dr. Payal Dutta ma'am, Shamata ma'am, and all other executive members of iSPELL. On behalf of everyone over here, I definitely would like to acknowledge the service and technical support which has been extended by the IT coordinator, Dr. Pramod Dengle sir. I've given him a name which actually tells Apat Bandhava. He is always there on toes to help us out and to make this every Sunday Sahitya Satsang to be a very organized way he executes it, in a very meticulous way he executes us. This is a committed group, what I say, who are there serving under this iSPELL as one mind. And sir keeps on telling, Gansham sir keeps on telling about it, that it is a mind where to facilitate and elevate, and the minds to mend them and blend the trends. So it is literally true. Sir, Pramod sir, thank you so much for your support, and you are the pillar of iSPELL, and congratulations, sir. And I extend my warm regards and gratitude even to the event coordinator, Puwama ma'am. She has come out with the series of such acknowledged professors and as a keynote speaker, which would be in like this particular month. We still have 4 more Sundays to go on under her event as an event coordinator. So special thanks to her. In her absence, I have taken it over, but we all are there to support her, and we will definitely execute according to the way she wanted this particular event to be executed. In her absence, I would extend my gratitude to her also. And I extend on behalf of iSPELL for all those members of different forums. There are 8 such forums heads who are there along with your members in this particular, who have participated and made this particular evening to be a very, very meaningful one. And it is an elated participation online on this particular e-seminar. So my sincere gratitude to each and everyone who have present over here on this Sunday to listen to this Sahitya Satsang. It is literally a feast to all our ears and minds and to enrich our knowledge. So once again, thanks to each and everyone who is present over here, who have made this particular evening a very, very meaningful and understanding one. Thank you so much, and happy Navaratri festival to each and everyone. And let Goddess Chamundeshwari bless all of us, and even to your family also, so that this particular year will go on in an excellent way. Thank you so much. And thanks you to once again to each one of you all.
Thank you, Indrani, for such a wonderful vote of thanks. And I think the coming sessions, coming satsangs would be very fruitful. And if I'm not mistaken, the next satsang is with Priyanka, who is the better of Dr. Varun. Is it so?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah. Okay, so it's a session to be looking forward. And I thank each one of the participants over here for joining us on this session.